Hello, my name is Jesse James Allen. I want to thank Columbus State University and the GGDA for having us out today for having me to allow you to talk about the Battle for Eire, which is one of my company's very first massive virtual reality projects in collaboration with Busch Gardens-Williamsburg. So there's two parts of this. The first part is talking about the ride and the design itself, and the second part of this is also to kind of teach you guys a skill. So the skill that I'm going to convey here is when somebody hands you a full script and said, make this a thing, what's the next step, right? All right, so let's talk about the ride for just a second here. As far as the content, I'll just play you the basic commercial for it.
There are two worlds in Ireland, the one you know and the other world.
The other world needs a warrior.
It is your love of this land that has brought you here today to help me protect the heart of Eire and to save the magic of Ireland.
The last remaining fairy guardian needs your help.
We've got to stop Baelor.
Go on an epic journey to save the magic of Ireland.
You are our last chance.
Join in the Battle for Eire, the new action VR ride, only at Busch Gardens-Williamsburg.
Okay, so that's the 30-second version of it. So what it is actually in their Ireland land. Busch Gardens is kind of themed out by various countries, I guess. You've got France, Ireland, Germany, all that kind of stuff. So in their Ireland area, they have this castle here. And inside this castle is this massive motion simulator, which I'll show you some footage of that a little bit later. We're talking something that's probably 20 feet or so off the ground that can move all of these seats at the same time. Now, this was formerly a different type of ride. They had Europe in the Eire and Corkscrew Hill, which were kind of some of their legacy rides in this facility here. And most of those used this massive screen to show the guests that kind of experience. They wanted to up the ante. They wanted it to be fully immersive. So they contacted Falcons Creative Group, and we had this huge discussion of how to do this in virtual reality. Ultimately, what happened is every one of these seats has an HTC Vive headset and a brand new way of dealing with loading a bunch of people in, getting them all in VR, and getting them off the ride quickly. So traditionally, it was like everybody'd sit down, there'd be some operator did pull all the straps and everything, how you doing, that little conversation. We came up with a system that essentially, before they get onto the ride, they put on this little helmet-like mask thing. And then when they sit down on the ride, they literally just grab the headset and it snaps on with a magnet. They can enjoy the presentation, pop that thing off, set it down, walk off, next guest. And then we can wash the headsets later. So that solves the hygiene problem in mass virtual reality. So that's a little bit on the tech side. The story itself is based in Irish mythology. So we have our guardian fairy, Addie, and her companion, which is a dragon named Malafeist. And essentially, they are protecting this thing called the Heart of Eire, which is like all the magic of Ireland in one gem. And this thing is under threat by Baelor, who decides that he wants to take it to wreak havoc on the other world, which is kind of the alternate version of Ireland. So here's our design parameters here. Tell a compelling VR story in under 5 minutes, because remember, this is a theme park ride. You got to get a lot of people on and off quickly. Make it about Irish mythology. Make it for guests, for all ages, to enjoy something that they get and understand. And of course, fly on a dragon. And there was also that last minute request, you got to work in Leprechaun. So get to that later. All right. So when you are a studio that is handed this task of we want all these things, this is kind of the hit list of at least how we had to approach making Battle for Eire. Now, when you kind of think of the task of somebody says, hey, I want you to make a ride or a video game or a movie, you're really amped up at first. You're like, this is great. And then you actually start making, you're like, how am I going to make this, right? And just as I say, they don't shoot a Harry Potter film with everybody just one day shows up on the sound set and then they're like, let's make a movie. It's there's a lot of planning going on. So the part I'm going to talk about here is right after the script, the foundation for how you take something from concept to reality. So the script obviously is a very important thing, kind of working backwards a little bit. You have your brainstorming sessions with your team, like what is it that we want to make? What is it that we want to convey? And of course, in this case, we pulled in all of like Irish lore and mythology and just Celtic characters and that kind of stuff. We have some really brilliant artists at our studio that came up with some really amazing drawings that were kind of inspiration of like, maybe this is how we can make these characters work. We had a script guy that came up with a great script and story that was compelling in a short amount of time. But as I started this conversation, what happens when that script is set on your desk? Make this a thing. Okay, so next thing I'm going to talk about is a ripper-matic. Now, this is kind of an unusual thing. And how many in here have actually heard of what a ripper-matic is? Anybody? So the reason you haven't is because no studio will ever publish one. It is essentially like if you go into an architecture firm, for instance, and they're building a building, you'll see this wall of inspiration, right? There'll be photographs of everything from other buildings to abstract things like birds and other things that they're taking shapes and designs for. A ripper-matic is that for moving pictures, right? So this is where your, geekdom pays off, right? It's when somebody says, here's all these ideas in a script. What would you think of if we expressed these ideas, right? And you can kind of go back in your mind of every video game you've ever played, every movie you've ever watched, every television show you've ever watched, anything that would relate to that, and you say, it would be kind of like this, right? And what we would do is we go out and we find all that material, just movies, video games, all that stuff, and we put it together in this like really mishmash collage to set up the pacing and the feel. So when you're trying to express to people, it would be kind of like this. You have a visual representation of what this is. And so I'm going to give you a little demo of what this is. And the reason why we don't ever share them, it's kind of like sand art, right? There's so much intellectual property that goes into all the materials that you use to build a ripper-matic, you would never be able to show it to anybody because of the liabilities and stuff. So it's kind of like created and destroyed. So when I say, and this is the audience participation part. So when I say, our first scene, this fairy warrior makes her way through a series of secret passageways and traps. Okay, just don't forget, just set aside the fairy warrior thing. Name me a game, a movie, a scene that somebody had to walk through a series of traps. Labyrinth, right? Anybody else? Absolutely. Okay, so if you were trying to express what that is to a producer or a creative group, you would go find that clip of the perfect thing and cut it together. And maybe you set it to music to kind of get your pacing. But now when you play it to somebody, they're like, oh, right, a trap, that exact thing, labyrinth, whatever. So this one, a hidden chamber is discovered with a dragon watching over a powerful treasure, right? Again.
Hobbit.
Right, Hobbit, any of those, yeah. So then you have the winged enemy minions steal the treasure, and the dragon attacks everything in the room. Again, any video game, movie, anything. Leroy Jenkins, right. So you might actually put in a clip of that. This is the chaos that we want to see unfold, right? And the nice part is, like I said, you're setting this stuff up to music, you cut it all together, and like I said, visually it's kind of a train wreck to watch, but it conveys the message. And that's the most important part, is to convey the message. And people are like, I love the way that flight scene unfolds. I like the way that, they did the fireball effects and all that stuff. And this is at the time, as artists, that you can dissect what made that successful. Why did you believe that scene? Why were you pulled into that moment in the scene? And also, why is it that you remember that scene how many ever years after you've seen this movie? Why was that the thing that popped into your head? Being able to dissect that, being able to watch that, being able to show that to the rest of your group gives birth to the next important thing, which is the storyboard, right? So, like I said, the ripper-matic is kind of like the hidden thing in production, and it's used in everything. I mean, I even know major motion pictures will put together a score on other scores of other films just to get the feel. This is what you call, how do you build the feel of the story that you're about to tell? So, I'm actually going to jump back to this one a little bit. So we're going to start in what's an animatic. And the animatic is essentially the artist's interpretation of what they felt in the ripper-matic. But now you're pulling in your characters, your environment, your story. But you're trying to put it into the context of the things that you found inspiring by that ripper-matic, right? By the way, ripper-matic is not something you just make and you're like, okay, we're good. Any idea how many versions of the ripper-matic we made for Battle of Eire? Just 2. 67. Ooh. Right? So it takes a while, but the nice part is, this is part of the fail fast, fail cheap thing. This is an editor and a bunch of people in a room coming up with some stuff. We throw it all into a mix. You know, we produce a piece that's the duration of the project that we want, but it's this mishmash collage. I'm not feeling this. This part takes too long. That's not coming off the way I thought. Maybe you need a different reference for that. Maybe you need a different part of the story, or put this in a different part of the story, or whatever. That is your time to make those big changes before you hand it off to your animation and CG team, and it gets really, really expensive to make a decision. So this is the next stage in that. And animatic is essentially a moving storyboard, right? So when you create the animatic, you are taking your script and your characters. You might even do temporary voiceover tracks or whatever, and you're creating cel-shaded animations that play every so often. So I'm going to actually play this for you to kind of like, or at least a scene, to show you what that's like.
Woo! There it is, the heart of Eire. Come quick! Wait, what's that? Oh no, the Snua found it! Leave them alone! No! Uh-oh, he doesn't know you! Take cover! Olifeist, it's all right. They're friends. They're here to help us. Let's go! The Snua are getting away!
So the things that, we're doing there is conveying, number one, what is the camera paying attention to? What is your composition? Where are your characters in relation to your camera? And just the general motion. Like, what should that scene feel like in kind of its context? The nice part about this, again, with the fail fast, fail cheap thing, is you build out the entire story this way. You can start to see things and hear things even in the commentary that this is taking too long, or the cadence doesn't feel right, or you're breaking the immersion, or some other problems that you're having. You can change this over and over and over again. It's going to cost you very little, because you're talking about the time of one editor and one storyboard artists. And just like the ripper-matic, it was just one editor. Now we're just adding one more person into the mix. And you can refine your story, consolidate it, tighten it up, and make it to the point where with audio is super easy to prototype with. You can create, lots of different versions of it. You can create this very tight, well-executed animatic that you're like, that is the film that we want to produce, right? And from there, you can export your still shots or whatever for reference that now your animation and compositing team can build on. Any idea how many animatic versions that we did for Battle of Eire?
167.
You're very close. 106 variations of the animatic for Battle for Eire. But the nice part is we were able to have those discussions about massive changes, and we even did a couple really major revisions with the client. They were like, we're feeling this. Great, no problem. You can you're as agile as can be in this state of production. You can do whatever you want. It's not going to cost you that much money. So now the question is how do you do this for VR, right? So VR is kind of a different beast in the fact that, you have a 360-degree experience and you want people to focus in on that specific spot in that whole world. We found that the best way to do that is give people a focal point. And one of the big reasons that we put the ferry in there that like kind of went from spot to spot, that was the focal point. That was your crosshairs to say, this is where you need to look in the VR world. So she's the one talking to you. She's the one that's kind of following you. The camera is locked to the ferry at all times. So as she moves, you're able to kind of see the world still from the third person perspective, but you always have that thing to, you know, this is where I need to be paying attention to. And anytime she moved her head to look at something, that's where you move your head to look at something. So you're building from the center out when creating a VR story. And that's kind of cool because then you can kind of put in all the details of the environment and whatnot. The camera stays smooth, which is really, really important. Mostly, especially when you're going, okay, I'm taking this and I'm putting it on a big platform that's going to move with people on it. You don't want people getting sick, especially mass groups of people, right? So there's a couple other things there. Hard cuts, of course, when you're talking about the entire environment's going to change brightness and depth and all that stuff. Hard cuts, really brutal for the end users, so try to ease that in, dissolves, transitions. We actually did this with portals. So as we went through different scenes, they would go through a portal. The portal would kind of like buffer your vision as you transferred from light scenes to dark scenes and that kind of thing. I already talked about the focal point thing and the avatar thing. Spinning, I don't even think I need to like talk about that. Spinning VR, not bad and good. Things that things shouldn't always be in motion, and you'll see that most rides, regardless of what theme park ride you're in, will have that stopping point. And there's a couple reasons for that. Like in audio, we always said you couldn't have a big sound without a small sound that precedes it. Like if everything's always like maximum intensity, it's just that, right? So in your stopping moments, you can actually, big, exciting, you're moving around, you're seeing, amazing things, you stop, you kind of settle the audience, then you can move them into the more, the next set of those things. They don't have to be twice as extreme or anything like that. They're ready for that motion again. It gives them a pause. Avoid tight spaces for long durations of time. I found that just the general VR experience, people like to look around, and that was kind of the cool part about this. You're on the back of a dragon, you're flying through this mystical world. You want to be able to look around and see all these things and feel like you're in that place, right? So I talked about our animatic. How close did it actually come to the final clip?
There it is, the heart of Eire. Looks like we beat him.
Wait, what's that? Oh no, the Slua! Those nasty little creatures! Back off, monsters! No! On a plate! Take cover! Right down on a face! They're friends! They're here to help us! They're gonna need a lift, Ollie. Look, the Slua have made a portal. Let's go.
So there, again, it's executed everything that I just said in VR. You have your focal point, you have your transition. The other thing that, of course, I can't really convey in this room is the sense of sound. So, like when the Slua are flying around in the theater, of course, we have the beautiful like pans and the multi-channel speakers and stuff like that. Sound is really underestimated in these kind of things, and helping people know where to look or feel like they need to look. So the nice part about this whole process is that now you are ready to turn it over to a team of people to make, right? And this is your animators who are building all things in Maya in this particular case, and your compositors and your lighting. That is a major endeavor, and it's a very expensive endeavor. So your fundamentals are so critical. Like if you feel great about your animatic and your storyboards, likely you're going to have a successful end product. If you kind of go in like, we'll kind of course correct once we're with the bigger team, you're going to go broke. it's like very, very critical that you nail down the basics. And that way it becomes less like we're guessing on how to make it pretty, but more like paint by number, where each discipline can add the greatest, they get to add all the cool details and lights and everything like that, but your story is so nailed down and you feel confident. And more importantly, in this case, your client feels very confident about it. Any questions at this point? Okay, moving on. All right, so this part I'm actually going to let some of my peers talk about the process from taking it from the animatic to the final film.
It all starts with an idea. And then from idea, eventually it goes to concept. We try a bunch of different iterations of what we think it could look like, and people will shoot down ideas. Eventually something comes about, and then we build on that idea.
You're telling a very complex story in a very short amount of time with a lot of moving parts. So we actually start with what do we want people to feel, and then we work our way through the story from there.
So we go through this methodology of creating storyboards from a script. We go to storyboards and start developing the characters and personalities. That then progresses to modeling. And then we start to utilize voice samples for tracks to get the personality out of the characters. We hire real voice talent to actually play the role. We animate to the voice itself. We actually start to develop the lighting and textures and environments, and ultimately bake all that in the render with the motion profile in place, and that becomes our attraction run.
Look, the Slua have made a portal. Let's go! Come on, Ollie. Faster! Faster! Hurry on!
It was insane. I've never done anything at all like it.
It's so immersive. You're able to look around. You're not just looking at something directly in front of you.
Special effects, the wind made you feel like you were actually flying.
Dragon is going, you feel like you're going with it and moving.
You feel like you're floating, like you're in another world.
You gotta ride this ride. I can't wait to take my little sister on it.
We're gonna tell our friends they definitely need to ride it.
After this thing went live, of course, we were there opening day and talking to some of the guests, and we're all like interested. What did you think of the media? What did you think of the motion? We did have fans and stuff that we tied into the motion profile. The motion profile for the base is largely based on the camera movement. So, in the scene, the camera dips down, the whole ride dips down. We had to fine tune that, but we were asking people, those intricate questions. Was like, did you feel the motion was right, whatever. What was hilarious is what came back, and that was that most of those people had never even experienced virtual reality before, right? Or they hadn't experienced it at that level, because you got to understand, a lot of theme park rides, they're literally like the cell phone, version of it. Now you're looking at a 5, like, wow. and a lot of them just were not used to that level of immersion. So it was kind of funny that was like their first experience in VR, and it kind of like it opens up the masses to the potential of it, because I think a lot of people, and one of the big issues of VR is that it's hard to demonstrate it for people, especially in a 2D or a YouTube video or something like that. It's like talking about swimming to somebody without jumping in a pool, So now you kind of expose a larger group of people to see how this feels and looks and whatnot. So a little bit more about the ride. Of course, we have a pre-story in the beginning. That there's like a queue system. We don't really like people waiting in lines a long time. So there's, sure, a little bit of line to get into the queue system. But inside that, we have a pre-story, which kind of starts out, kind of looks like a Diablo-esque type black and white book come to life kind of thing. It tells like the backstory of, all the scenario that you're about to become part of. And then you go into this room here, which is the, safety, how to deal with your equipment and enjoy the experience, which we did very comically with leprechauns that are fumbling things. So kind of made it fun and tied in the leprechauns, because we were like, how do you work like This is a picture of the actual motion base for the Battle for Eire, like if you're underneath. So this whole thing can tilt and move, and it's pretty quick, and certainly some really crazy angles. And this is the final array of seating for all the guests, and they literally just sit down and snap on the headset. We even had some interactivity there where they can look around, and it does like eyeball selecting of elements, and you can kind of start some interactivity. Of course, we're looking more into that in the future for a fully interactive and immersive experience in 3D. So that is the basics of it. We'll open the floor up for questions at this point.
So you talked about polling the audience afterwards, but I'm sure you watched them while they're going through the physical reactions they're having. What are the physical reactions you want them to have?
Sure. We certainly want them to be thrilled, but not freaked out necessarily. It's not that kind of ride. It's not the roller coaster kind of thing. But we also want them to feel like the ride itself and the media are not two separate things, right? That it feels natural and it feels like it's part of the story. Because a lot of times what happens in these presentations is that people do it just because they can, right? It's just because we have the technology to make it, that kind of thing. We'll build it for this experience, custom tailor it, so every single thing feels together. Like, why is there a motion platform? Well, you're on a dragon. Now it makes sense. You have the, that connection for the guest that says, yeah, that's what it'd feel like to fly on a dragon. No one knows what it's like to fly on a dragon. But you got to have that idea, right? So
I wasn't here for the whole time. I had to step out. But
sure.
So this may have been in the talk. Were there any 4D or 5D elements, I guess, like blowing smoke, wind, anything?
Yes. Of course, everybody's in headsets, so they wouldn't notice much in the theater. But we do have fans. Yeah. And so we'll do tricks like, they'll have a thing where it feels like you're flying faster, right? Well, the back end of the motion simulator tilts up, and you start to lean down, and the fans kick on full speed. Well, your perception in virtual reality isn't that that is happening. It is all of a sudden the dragon is kind of like, arced out its wings, and now you're doing the big dive. And it's crazy because visually you can show something that is like significant, 30, 40 feet in distance, but you're not really moving people more than a few feet. But because all those senses are combined, your body feels like, wow, this is this really exciting thing. But that's the fine-tuning part, because obviously too much of that and you can get people either nervous or sick or what. Yeah. So.
But you do have anything in addition to the fans, like even directed stuff or water or something like that?
Nothing, so not in this particular one.
99% all VR.
Yes. Cool. Yeah. And sound, obviously. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so I'm the virtual reality girl, and so
no problem.
The mass adoption for virtual reality is at a slower rate than what we expected.
Right.
And so with rides like this, and do you think that the riders actually realize that it is available for them to take home to them? Do you think that? And also another thing is, after you're done with the development, right? Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure that it stopped. Like you probably don't go through and do the training for the ride attendants and stuff like that. But one of the things that with the especially with the SeaWorld experience, mm-hmm. I found out that the attendees was actually going and telling the riders that to not use the virtual reality, that it would make them sick. And so how do you think that we get over that part of it, and to make more awareness that this technology is available for consumer use?
Okay, so there's kind of two thoughts of this. The first thing is we actually did go and train the staff and sit with them through the whole debug process, along with the people that help kind of tune up the entire system to run really efficiently. That's really important, because obviously just setting up your headset wrong can give you a bad experience, right? Like if your focal points, like the headset's a little too high, it looks blurry, that kind of stuff. Training them, and when people are saying these things, they probably mean these things, and kind of getting that knowledge base built for them. For the guests, they certainly start to go, oh, that's a Vive, or something like that. They recognize what that is, and now they go, well, that makes sense, because you're never going to get that demo at a Best Buy, right? And for the industry as a whole, and I've seen a lot of, especially lately, the kind of ripcord the industry has of like, VR's failing, it's not going to go well, and the conversation needs to be like, you're just talking about the headsets. Right. Really, you're just talking about the headsets. There is just this explosion of stuff that we are learning about augmentation, mixed reality, and everything that actually goes beyond headsets.
Yes.
And headsets were like the very first step into this kind of thing.
Absolutely.
And we're already starting to see the next evolutions of that. Our company has actually done a couple of these things where we have these massive rooms with tons of projectors that kind of give you that holodeck-ish kind of feel where it feels like you're transported to a different place. And we're experimenting with different things. We have one in Washington, D.C. that's kind of like a virtual tourism kind of thing and whatnot. But this, it starts to expand beyond just headsets. And that's really the most important thing. And that's something that's just not being communicated to the media, that like, you know, you're just watching stage one, man. I mean, and not to mention the headsets themselves are doing extraordinary things. HTC with their latest Vive Pro doesn't even have cables attached to it. Like that's a big difference in itself. Your freedom of the whole idea of room sense, when that became a thing, you know, I don't think the media really, or the press, I should say, grasped onto that. Not only can you see this thing in 3D and whatnot, you can walk around this thing.
Yes,
and that's incredible. And what that's going to lead to, which is like, you know, light field technology and whatnot that we're starting to see experiments of. Google had recently published their light field tests where you're sitting on the, you know, Space Shuttle Discovery and you're able to like look at a still photograph and move and see behind the seats of the shuttle and the controls and everything. It's like, it's nearly magic. And that's one of those things that I think needs to be conveyed to the press, is that it's a...
I'm trying really hard.
Yeah, it is really, these kinds of things are the start of a much, much grander experience. But this kind of thing really helps in the fact that you're having really high quality headsets and whatnot, an experience that everybody can get in, an entire family can get in and enjoy it and wrap their mind around that's what that is.
Absolutely.
You know?
And it's funny though, because I have not heard like much about this at all. And like, and you are right. Like, and so what I think that the solution would be also as well for the manufacturers to realize that the headset is nothing without the software, and vice versa. You cannot have software without the headset. So, so I do a lot of live streaming and promoting the technology from what's inside of the headset. So I use it in a different kind of way, and so I support you, and I want to try it. I just want to try it. I want to go to Busch Gardens and try it.
Oh, it's fun. And actually, I remember, you know, we had gone through all of our development. We sat down and you know, did our internal studio tests with it and everything. I tell you, there was a universe of difference between seeing it in our studio and sitting on that ride and having all the motions, the sound, the wind, and all of a sudden it was like, wow, that really did feel real. You know,
absolutely. I'm like the mouth of so I'm from Georgia, so it's true. I'm the mouth of the South, so I've been like, I've networked throughout the entire industry, so I will definitely let everybody know exactly what you guys are doing.
Cool. I appreciate that.
What specific portions did you work on?
Well, as an editorial director, essentially I start off at the beginning of the concept. Here's the script, make it a thing. And that's just, you know, sitting with the group and trying things and evolve it and working with the animators to, you know, kind of come up with what's the feel and pacing of our story. Also, my audio background really helped in kind of like, you know, building out the cadence of the narration and the character dialogue back and forth to fit in a specific amount of timing. And then we went and, you know, actually found the actors and kind of was able to give them direction to try to make it sound better, you know, like give us the real performance, make these characters a real thing. And then at the end, after, you know, all the wizards in our studio come up with this thing that looks like incredible, edit this back together and make it, you know, a final version of what that original glimpse was, you know, could have been almost a year ago, right? So it's kind of fun. It's like you get to, you know, create something and you get to also kind of see after you created it what other people can do with that idea, and then that goes huge. So.
Got a question online.
All right, from Raphael Leon, 2107 on Twitch. As an educator interested in video games as pedagogical tools, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that word. I'd want to know if you see VR as having a future in education, and if so, how?
Interesting. Well, I definitely see VR, well, just the realities in general in education becoming a thing. Some people talk about that as, can you make it something that's developed in the classroom? From my lens, it's basically, I would love to find a way to start augmenting museums. Because essentially, like when people go there to learn and to be inspired, it's like, okay, so this is the right group to ask this question, right? Y'all played Assassin's Creed, right? Yeah, okay. So how much about history of those different environments did you learn from playing that game? I bet, right? Yeah, because it's like you're immersed in it, right? And it becomes not only something that, oh, I read about that, but something you experienced, right? I think when you start to do those kinds of augmentations to real places of education, then people have an emotional attachment to that thing. And that is the game changer, right? So.
The audio part, the audio is external, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I was thinking that it was per headset, like, you know, the other, but that's not an issue. So technically, do you have renderers for each one of the headsets?
They all have their own computer.
They all have their own PC?
Yes.
But then you have to actually have a server actually combining the whole structure so that you will be able to render each one of
Everything's
those.
synchronized, yes.
Interesting.
So I'm curious, was there ever a quote beta, and did you do any A/B testing with live audiences?
Definitely. They had, after we set up the profile, of course, there was a lot of contractors and workers that dialed in the motion stuff. There's some safety things that obviously have to happen in a ride scenario to make sure that, you know, you're up to snuff. And then they had what they call like early access. So certain pass members, you know, were invited by the park to come out and try some stuff, try out the experience and provide their feedback. And that gave us time to kind of work through it. And then afterwards, after, you know, even on opening day, we were there to kind of like help them through any little technical issues that, you know, would start to come up. Busch Gardens was great. I mean, they were so ready for this. And they were, you know, like really had done their homework on how to make this a wonderful experience for the people who came in and everything. And they just like, their staff was just really eager and kind of knew that they were going to go through this kind of evolution with this ride. And it just, you know, they embraced all of it. And, you know, I went there at opening day. I went there like 2 weeks ago. It took my whole family. Like the best way to like, you know, show your family this is why I was late a few times is to take them on there and let them sit down and experience. And it was just great to not, you know, say, well, that's a cool job to just go, that was really amazing experience, you know, and that's a great feeling. And not to mention, like, this is something that game developers, we don't get to experience very often. Like in games, you release things to the public, you kind of hear the echo off the internet, right? People on the forums and whatnot. Is a totally different experience when you put together something like this and you sit with an audience and you ride this thing together and you hear people like yelling and in fear or you know, happy or laughing or whatever. And it's just like, wow. I mean, talk about a really deep sense of gratification. That's incredible.
So I'd like to continue talking about dealing with the client.
Yes.
So all the parks know they need a new type of experience.
Yeah.
VR has been the thing, and in some cases I'm hearing from people that it's very much the client just saying, give me something VR, I don't know what I want.
Right.
And in other cases, they kind of are the leads right now. So how was it? How much hand-holding did you have to do? How much did they know coming in? How much was it a learning experience both sides?
Sure. Well, I think Busch Gardens actually had done their homework tremendously in this case. So they really did know a lot of what they wanted to do. And so it was a really cool co-development of like building on the idea of like how to take a ride that was, you know, the concept of a ride that was good and make it like really good, you know? And it was really cool that they were really in sync with us. They were in sync with us through the whole pre-production of it. And even, you know, when we were doing ripper-matics and animatics and providing that feedback of like the insight that as a designer you don't get. And that's the real world feedback of like, here's things that people love about rides that exist. Like they've been doing their parks and whatever over 40 years. You know, they have tons of insight about what guests love and what guests would like to experience. Even if you're an awesome design studio, that knowledge is invaluable, right? So it was wonderful to kind of get that and kind of work through that whole process with them. So
they already knew you never go wrong.
I think, yeah, there was always that expectation. I just remember that when we were like, how are we working at leprechauns, you know, because that's such a comical thing, yeah.
I have one more question. I'm so sorry.
Sure.
Okay. So my other question is kind of piggybacking off of what his question or whatever. But so what about there is experiences out there that isn't varied, and so how does a client choose their right development team, and why do you think so? And here's another thing too. Do you agree with the fact that the cheaper route isn't always the better route?
Right.
Right. So it's very important for people to know that too as well. That it's not always to go to the cheaper route, because there is games out there that is not.
Well, and I think what you're asking for is that, you know, there's people out there that are like, we want to be part of this new technology. We want to bring that to the public, and they'll just kind of hire whoever to do it.
Yeah.
Right? And what that is a lot of times a client paying a studio to learn that technology. That's a dangerous place, right? So where we had kind of an unusual advantage in this is that we had actually been making large format dome films and stuff for a very long time. So, you know, we had already done this with mass audiences of, you know, 500 people or whatever, and they can come in and experience these kinds of things. And we knew how to deal with camera movement and how to tell a story in a 360-degree environment and all that kind of stuff. That information is really helpful when you're trying to, you know, convey that even on a smaller scale. Yeah, sure, we can take that concept and downsize that. Mm-hmm. So it's really trying to find what is your developer's history? What is the team that you're about to hire? What is their history in this format? And find the experts in that.
Right. Okay. So
yeah.
All you clients out there, you guys got the answer.
You got to do your research. Yeah, you got to do your research. Yeah.
How'd you come up with a script for this ride? It's only 5 minutes, so I'm like, how'd you do that?
Yeah, well, you know, and that's kind of, how, you know, coming up with a script that's compelling is, you know, you really have your writers to say, this is what we think that this should actually be, you know, and then you start that whole process, and through both the ripper-matic and the animatic, you tune it, because you say, okay, maybe, you know, scripting-wise, that's too lengthy, or I'm starting to see things visually that answer things I was doing with dialogue beforehand, because, you know, it's an evolving process. And then you kind of refine that and refine that and refine that. I mean, the job of both an editor and a writer is, you know, not necessarily creating from the ground up, but you're like a sculptor, right? You have your first pass, and this is kind of where we're starting, and you just chip away at it until it becomes the thing that you hoped it would be, right? And I think the big misconception about that is that it's something that happens quickly. It doesn't happen quickly. Like I said, there's massive amounts of revisions and reiterations, and some people look at that as like, oh, we didn't get it right, or oh, we got to start again, or whatever. I see that as like the next layer in refinement until you finally have this thing that you're like, I feel like I can, you know, tell this story and the amount of time that I'm trying to tell it in the most convincing way, right? So be patient, and this is all about the game of persistence. Be persistent, keep your vision, you know, there, and just chip away at it, and don't let the revisions get to you.
Thank you.
Sure.
How did you go about taking into consideration limitations that come with aiming it towards kids when it comes to reality, since, you know, they'll be a bit more like sensitive?
Sure. Well, the other thing with kids that's kind of fun is obviously the fairy character, right? The avatar. Kids in general are usually less afraid of trying something or experiencing something if they've got a buddy, right? Whether it's their parents or their best friend or whatever. And so that was kind of the whole point of like the pre-show and kind of the early part of just the opening part of the film being just about the fairy. Is the fairy is like, I'm fearless and I know I can do this, but I could use your help, you know, that kind of thing. And that character helps build their confidence through experiencing this thing more confidently. Like, well, she's definitely not going to get hurt, so I'm going to be fine, you know? And that's kind of the catalyst. Like I said, it becomes not only the visual focal point to pull you through the whole film, but also becomes like their relatable character, right?
But also,
Dragon, not too scary for him.
Dragon, which is funny because he starts off that way, but again,
he
by
got a lot rounder.
yeah, but you know, even the simple, you know, transition of like it's kind of sniffing you out, and you know, it's like a, you know, a fierce dog kind of like. After a while, you're like, no, that's a cool animal, right? So that's how it works.
But also considering like the sensitivities with the equipment for
Right.
children, as far as he goes with all the movement and things like that. Like, how was that process with?
That was cool, and that was really a part of Busch Gardens, like talking to us about don't call it equipment, don't call it like your headset and your, you know, screen or whatever. It was, you know, the emerald mask and all that stuff. I mean, you're tying it into the story, right? Like these are the
More
actual
distractions.
right. You're like, well, yeah, it's like, you know, I got the emerald mask and I got the enchanted lens. Well, I want to see what the enchanted lens does. You know, it becomes a cool thing.
Like
it's
a
not
sleight of hand.
just the VR headset. Nobody wants to hear that. If you call it under a unique name, it becomes more inviting and more accessible to people of all ages. So, yeah.
Any more questions online? Okay, we're out of time. All right, so I'll ask the last question. Where do you find a shirt that Eire green?
Yeah, I went to a formal shop and I was explaining what it was, and the guy just gave me the most blank look. I'll check in the back. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming out.